Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we will talk about the rat Micah Bell. If you have not subscribed to the channel, then please do for more videos. Let's begin. In the quiet hours when shadows grow long and the mind seeks to understand the darker corners of human nature, there exists a tale of a man whose very presence could poison the strongest bonds of brotherhood. This is the story of Micah Bell III, a character whose psychological complexity runs as deep as the mountain caves where he would meet his end, and whose influence would prove more destructive than any bullet or blade. Tonight, as we journey through the twisted pathways of this troubled mind, we explore not to glorify his darkness, but to understand the mechanisms that create such individuals. Through the flickering light of campfire wisdom, we'll trace the psychological threads that wove together to create one of the most compelling and disturbing antagonists in the annals of storytelling. The story begins not with Micah himself, but with the poisoned legacy that flowed through the Bell family bloodline like a river of darkness. His grandfather, Micah Bell I, had established a family tradition that would echo through generations, a philosophy that celebrated violence, rejected moral constraints, and embraced a worldview where only the ruthless survive and the weak exist merely to be exploited. Micah Bell Jr., born in 1839, carried this toxic inheritance forward with devastating efficiency. A wanted man for murder in 5 counties, he embodied a nihilistic philosophy that would shape his son's worldview from the earliest age. In the Bell household, empathy was weakness, moral considerations were naive idealism, and the only values that mattered were personal survival and dominance over others. Young Micah Bell III grew up breathing this poisoned air, watching his father's criminal activities, witnessing his disregard for human life, and learning that genuine human connection was something to be viewed with suspicion and contempt. From his earliest memories, violence was normalized, deception was rewarded, and the idea that people might genuinely care for one another was dismissed as foolish fantasy. The psychological development of a child in such an environment follows predictable but tragic patterns. Where most children learn to trust through consistent care and affection, Micah learned to manipulate through observation of his father's tactics. Where other children develop empathy through experiencing compassion, Micah learned to exploit weakness through witnessing his father's predatory behavior. Where healthy children form secure attachments that teach them about love and loyalty, Micah learned that all relationships are transactional and temporary. The absence of a nurturing maternal influence left young Micah without any counterbalance to his father's toxic masculinity. Without the gentle touch of empathy or the warm embrace of unconditional love, the boy's emotional development became stunted, twisted into patterns that would serve him well in a world of predators, but leave him forever incapable of experiencing genuine human connection. The psychological concept of attachment theory becomes crucial in understanding Micah's development. Healthy attachment relationships in early childhood provide the foundation for emotional regulation, empathy development, and the ability to form meaningful relationships throughout life. Children who experience secure attachment learn that they are worthy of love, that others can be trusted, and that relationships can provide comfort and support during difficult times. Micah's early experiences taught him the opposite lessons. He learned that love is conditional and temporary, that trust is dangerous and naive, that relationships exist only to be exploited for personal gain. These early lessons became the foundation of his worldview and shaped every relationship he would form throughout his life. The trauma of growing up in such an environment would have created lasting changes in Micah's brain development, particularly in areas responsible for empathy, emotional regulation, and moral reasoning. Research in neuroscience has shown that chronic stress and trauma during childhood can alter brain structure and function in ways that persist into adulthood, making it extremely difficult for individuals to develop healthy relationship patterns later in life. His brother Amos would eventually recognize the family's toxicity and flee to California, seeking a different kind of life. But for Micah, his brother's escape represented not inspiration, but betrayal, a rejection of the only truth he had ever known. In Micah's twisted psychology, Amos's attempt at redemption was weakness, cowardice, and abandonment of the harsh realities that governed existence. The psychological dynamics between the Bell brothers provide fascinating insights into how different individuals can respond to the same toxic environment. While both were exposed to their father's nihilistic philosophy and criminal lifestyle, their responses diverged dramatically. Amos eventually found the strength to recognize the destructive nature of their upbringing and make the difficult choice to break free from the family's criminal legacy. This divergence illustrates an important principle in developmental psychology. Even within the most dysfunctional families, individuals can sometimes find the resources to choose a different path. Amos's escape may have been facilitated by factors we can only speculate about. Perhaps a teacher who showed him kindness, a book that opened his mind to different possibilities, or simply an innate resilience that allowed him to resist the psychological conditioning that so thoroughly shaped his brother. For Micah, however, his brother's choice represented a fundamental threat to his understanding of reality. If Amos could choose differently, if redemption was possible, if people could genuinely change and find meaning beyond self-interest, then everything Micah had been taught about human nature might be wrong. This possibility was so threatening to his psychological stability that he had to reject it completely, viewing his brother's transformation as betrayal rather than growth. The rage that Micah felt toward his brother would influence his relationships throughout his life. Anyone who demonstrated genuine goodness, who showed capacity for growth and redemption, who proved that people could choose love over hate and cooperation over competition, became a threat to his fundamental understanding of reality. This explains his particular hatred for Arthur Morgan and his visceral reaction to Arthur's moral awakening. Arthur represented the same challenge to his worldview that Amos had posed years earlier. As Micah matured into adulthood, these early wounds manifested in a personality that exhibited narcissism, manipulation, and a complete lack of empathy. His grandiose self-regard, his manipulative brilliance, and his inability to feel genuine remorse would make him a formidable predator in the world of outlaws and criminals. The psychological structure that emerged from Micah's traumatic upbringing was both sophisticated and deeply disturbed. His narcissistic traits provided him with the grandiose self-image necessary to justify his harmful actions and to maintain his sense of superiority over others. His Machiavellian tendencies gave him the strategic thinking and emotional detachment needed to manipulate others effectively. His psychopathic characteristics, the lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and impulsive behavior, freed him from the moral constraints that limit most people's willingness to harm others. This combination of traits, often referred to as the dark triad in psychological research, created a personality that was uniquely suited for causing psychological and emotional damage to others. Unlike individuals who harm others impulsively or out of desperation, Micah's harmful behavior was calculated, strategic, and designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. His criminal career before joining the Van der Linde gang had provided him with extensive practice in reading people's weaknesses, exploiting their vulnerabilities, and manipulating their emotions for personal gain. Each successful manipulation reinforced his belief in his own superiority and his contempt for the weakness of others. By the time he encountered Dutch's gang, he had become a master manipulator with years of experience in psychological warfare. The psychological skills that Micah had developed were not limited to simple deception or intimidation. He had learned to identify the specific psychological needs and vulnerabilities of different personality types, to tailor his approach to each individual's particular weaknesses, and to maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously without becoming confused or contradicting himself. These abilities made him particularly dangerous in a group setting, where he could work on multiple targets at once while playing them against each other. When fate brought Micah Bell to the Van der Linde gang in 1899, he arrived not as a lost soul seeking family, but as a psychological virus seeking a host. The gang, with its bonds of loyalty and shared ideals, represented everything his upbringing had taught him to despise and exploit. Here was a group of people who genuinely cared for one another, who shared resources and risks, who believed in something greater than individual survival. To most observers, the Van der Linde gang's family-like bonds would have been admirable, even enviable. They'd created something rare in the criminal underworld, a group bound together not just by mutual benefit but by genuine affection and loyalty. Dutch Van der Linde had built more than a criminal organisation. He'd created a chosen family that provided its members with identity, purpose and belonging. But to Micah's predatory psychology, these bonds represented not beauty but opportunity. He saw their love for one another not as strength but as vulnerability, their trust not as a foundation for cooperation but as a tool for manipulation. The very qualities that made the gang special, their loyalty, their willingness to sacrifice for each other, their belief in Dutch's vision of freedom and dignity, were the same qualities that Micah would exploit to destroy them. The psychological challenge that the gang presented to Micah was significant. These were not naive marks or desperate individuals who could be easily manipulated through simple promises or threats. They were experienced criminals who had survived countless dangers together, who had learned to trust their instincts about people, and who had developed strong bonds of mutual loyalty and protection. Micah understood that direct confrontation or obvious manipulation would be quickly detected and rejected by such a group. Instead, he would need to employ more sophisticated psychological tactics, gradually undermining their relationships from within, exploiting existing tensions and insecurities, and positioning himself as indispensable while making others seem unreliable or disloyal. His initial approach was masterful in its calculated deception. He presented himself as a dedicated and capable member, willing to take risks and make sacrifices for the group's benefit. But this presentation was entirely strategic, a carefully crafted performance designed to gain acceptance and position within the gang's hierarchy, while he studied their weaknesses and planned their destruction. The psychological mask that Micah wore during his early days with the gang was nearly perfect. He displayed just the right amount of enthusiasm without seeming desperate, showed competence without appearing to challenge established hierarchies, and demonstrated loyalty without seeming sycophantic. This performance required tremendous psychological skill and self-control, as he had to suppress his natural contempt for their values while appearing to embrace them wholeheartedly. Dutch van der Linde, the gang's charismatic leader, became Micah's primary target. Dutch's complex psychology, his intelligence, his grandiose self-image, and his underlying insecurities provided Micah with both opportunities and challenges. If he could gain Dutch's trust and influence his decisions, he could effectively control the entire gang. Dutch represented a fascinating psychological puzzle for Micah to solve. The gang leader was clearly intelligent and charismatic, capable of inspiring genuine loyalty and devotion in his followers. He possessed a sophisticated understanding of philosophy, literature, and human nature that made him a formidable opponent for anyone attempting to manipulate him. Yet beneath this impressive exterior, Micah detected the psychological vulnerabilities that he could exploit. Dutch's grandiose self-image was perhaps his greatest weakness. He genuinely believed himself to be a visionary leader, a philosopher king who understood truths that others could not grasp. This grandiosity made him susceptible to flattery and validation, particularly when it came from someone who seemed to truly appreciate his intellectual superiority and moral vision. His underlying insecurities, carefully hidden beneath layers of confidence and charisma, provided additional opportunities for manipulation. Dutch's fear of abandonment, his need for constant validation, and his paranoid tendencies about betrayal were all psychological pressure points that a skilled manipulator could exploit. Micah understood that Dutch's greatest fear was not death or capture, but the loss of his followers' loyalty and respect. The psychological dance between Micah and Dutch unfolded with the patience of a spider weaving its web. Micah consistently validated Dutch's ego, reinforcing the leader's belief in his own superiority and destiny. He positioned himself as Dutch's most devoted admirer, the only one who truly understood the great man's vision and potential. This validation was particularly powerful because it came at a time when Dutch was facing increasing challenges to his authority and competence from law enforcement and rival gangs. The world was changing around them, and the old ways of doing things were becoming less effective. In this environment of uncertainty and pressure, Micah's unwavering support and confidence in Dutch's leadership became increasingly valuable to the gang leader. But validation alone was not enough to achieve Micah's goals. He needed to isolate Dutch from the voices of reason and moral guidance that might counteract his influence. This required a more subtle approach, gradually undermining Dutch's relationships with his oldest and most trusted allies, while appearing to be concerned only with the gang's welfare and Dutch's best interests. The psychological techniques Micah employed were sophisticated and multifaceted. He would plant seeds of doubt about other gang members' loyalty, suggest that they were questioning Dutch's judgment behind his back, and gradually convince the increasingly paranoid leader that his oldest friends were preparing to betray him. These suggestions were crafted with psychological precision, exploiting Dutch's deepest fears and insecurities while appearing to come from a place of genuine concern and loyalty. As Micah's influence grew, the gang's dynamics began to shift in subtle but profound ways. His nihilistic philosophy started to challenge their shared values and beliefs. His selfish behavior undermined the cooperative spirit that had sustained them through previous challenges. Like a psychological virus, his cynicism, paranoia, and aggression gradually infected other gang members. The transformation was not immediate but unfolded over months of careful psychological warfare. Micah understood that direct confrontation would fail. These were experienced outlaws who had survived countless dangers together. Instead, he worked through whispers and insinuations, through carefully timed comments that planted doubt, through strategic displays of loyalty to Dutch that made questioning him seem like questioning the leader himself. In the campfire conversations that had once been filled with camaraderie and shared stories, Micah's presence introduced a new element of tension and suspicion. His mocking comments about other gang members, disguised as jokes, gradually eroded the mutual respect that had characterized their interactions. His constant needling of Arthur, his dismissive attitude toward the women, his racist provocations toward Charles and Lenny, all of these behaviors served to poison the atmosphere of trust and affection that had made the gang feel like family. The psychological principle at work here was simple but devastatingly effective. Negative emotions and attitudes spread more easily than positive ones. Micah's cynicism was contagious, his paranoia infectious, his cruelty normalized through repetition. Each gang member who began to adopt his worldview became another vector for spreading the psychological virus he had introduced into their community. Dutch's increasing reliance on Micah's counsel represented the most visible sign of this corruption. The leader who had once valued Hosea's wisdom and Arthur's loyalty now seemed to trust only Micah's harsh pragmatism. This shift was not accidental, but the result of Micah's systematic campaign to isolate Dutch from voices of reason and moral guidance, while positioning himself as the only truly loyal and realistic advisor. Bill Williamson, with his insecurities about his intelligence and his desperate need for acceptance, became one of Micah's first converts. Bill had always been sensitive about being dismissed as stupid or incompetent, and Micah recognized this vulnerability with predatory precision. He began by offering Bill validation and respect, treating him as an equal and even as someone whose opinion mattered. This attention was intoxicating for Bill, who had spent years feeling like the gang's least valued member. Micah would seek his counsel on matters both trivial and important, making Bill feel included and respected in ways he had rarely experienced. This process of building Bill up was not kindness, but strategy. Micah was creating an emotional dependency that he could later exploit. As Bill became more attached to Micah's validation, he also became more willing to adopt Micah's worldview and support his positions within the gang. When Micah criticized Arthur or questioned Hosea's judgment, Bill found himself nodding along, grateful for the acceptance of someone who seemed to value him. This gradual process of corruption transformed Bill from a loyal, if insecure, gang member into someone who would eventually side with Micah and Dutch against his former brothers. Javier Escuella's loyalty to Dutch and his desire for acceptance within the gang made him vulnerable to Micah's influence in different ways. Javier had fled Mexico under dangerous circumstances and found in the Vanda Linda gang not just safety, but a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. His gratitude to Dutch for saving his life created a deep emotional bond that Micah learned to exploit with surgical precision. By positioning himself as Dutch's most trusted ally, Micah gradually drew Javier into his sphere of influence, exploiting the younger man's insecurities and need for belonging. Javier's fear of being cast out, of losing the only family he had ever known, made him susceptible to arguments about loyalty and pragmatism. When Micah suggested that questioning Dutch's judgment was tantamount to betrayal, Javier found himself caught between his own moral instincts and his desperate need to remain part of the group. The psychological pressure Micah applied was subtle but relentless. He would make comments about how some gang members seemed to be losing faith in Dutch's leadership, how they were becoming soft and sentimental, how only the truly loyal would stand by their leader when times got tough. These suggestions planted seeds of doubt in Javier's mind about his own standing within the gang and his obligations to Dutch. As the gang situation became more desperate, Javier's fear of abandonment grew stronger, making him more susceptible to Micah's influence. The young man who'd once been guided by a strong moral compass found himself gradually adopting a more cynical worldview, justifying increasingly questionable actions as necessary for survival and loyalty. This transformation was not sudden, but occurred through countless small compromises, each one making the next seem more reasonable and inevitable. But not everyone in the gang was susceptible to Micah's psychological manipulation. Arthur Morgan represented everything that Micah despised and feared: genuine loyalty, moral complexity, and the capacity for growth and redemption. Arthur's evolution throughout their time together, his growing moral awareness, and his ultimate willingness to sacrifice himself for others represented a fundamental threat to the nihilistic worldview that defined Micah's existence. The antagonism between Micah and Arthur was not merely personal, it was philosophical. Arthur's journey toward redemption challenged the core belief that had sustained Micah throughout his life: that human nature is fundamentally selfish, that morality is weakness, and that only the ruthless survive. If Arthur could change, if he could find meaning and purpose beyond self-interest, then Micah's entire worldview would crumble. Arthur's transformation was particularly threatening to Micah because it was genuine and observable. The man who had once been Dutch's most ruthless enforcer was becoming increasingly troubled by the gang's violent activities, more concerned with protecting innocent people, more willing to show mercy and compassion. This evolution was not weakness, as Micah tried to portray it, but strength. The kind of moral courage that Micah could never understand or possess. The psychological warfare between Arthur and Micah played out in countless small interactions and confrontations. Micah's constant needling and provocation of Arthur was not just personal animosity, but a systematic attempt to prove that Arthur's apparent goodness was false, that his moral development was an illusion, and that ultimately everyone would choose self-preservation over principle when faced with the ultimate test. Arthur's response to this psychological pressure revealed the depth of his character development. Rather than being drawn into Micah's games or allowing himself to be corrupted by constant exposure to cynicism and cruelty, Arthur used these challenges as opportunities to clarify and strengthen his own moral convictions. Each of Micah's attacks on his character forced Arthur to examine his own motivations and choices, ultimately leading him toward greater self-awareness and moral clarity. The tragic irony of their relationship is that Micah's attempts to corrupt Arthur actually contributed to Arthur's redemption. By serving as a constant reminder of what Arthur did not want to become, Micah inadvertently helped Arthur define and embrace his better nature. This unintended consequence of Micah's psychological manipulation demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of finding meaning and growth even in the face of persistent negativity and corruption. Charles Smith presented another challenge to Micah's psychological dominance. When Micah looked at Charles, he saw everything he lacked: genuine confidence, moral integrity, and the respect of others earned through character rather than fear. Charles possessed a quiet strength that came from deep self-knowledge and unwavering principles, qualities that made him largely immune to Micah's manipulation tactics. To compensate for his own fragile masculinity, Micah lashed out with cruelty and prejudice, desperate to tear Charles down to his own miserable level. His racist provocations and aggressive posturing were attempts to provoke Charles into the kind of emotional reaction that would give Micah psychological leverage over him. But Charles understood something that Micah never could. That true strength comes from self-control, not from the ability to hurt others. Charles's refusal to be provoked by Micah's taunts represented a form of psychological strength that Micah could not comprehend. When faced with Micah's attempts at intimidation, Charles would simply look at him with calm, steady eyes that seemed to see right through the bluster and aggression to the frightened, inadequate man beneath. This quiet confidence was more devastating to Micah than any angry response could have been, because it exposed his weakness without giving him anything to fight against. The dynamic between Charles and Micah illustrated an important truth about dealing with manipulative individuals. Refusing to engage with their provocations often exposes their weakness and desperation more effectively than any direct confrontation. Charles's approach was not passive, but actively resistant, maintaining his dignity and principles while denying Micah the emotional reaction he craved. Hosea Matthews, the gang's wise elder and moral compass, represented perhaps Micah's most formidable opponent. Hosea's wisdom, experience, and genuine care for the gang members made him a significant obstacle to Micah's influence. Unlike Dutch, whose intelligence was compromised by grandiosity and paranoia, Hosea possessed a mature understanding of human nature that made him largely immune to Micah's manipulation tactics. Hosea had seen enough of life to recognize predatory behavior when he encountered it. His years of experience with criminals and con men had taught him to identify the warning signs of someone who could not be trusted, and Micah displayed those signs in abundance. But Hosea also understood that direct confrontation might backfire by forcing Dutch to choose between his old friend and his new ally, a choice that might not go in Hosea's favour given Dutch's current state of mind. Instead, Hosea attempted to counter Micah's influence through gentle guidance, and by serving as a living example of the values and principles that Micah sought to undermine. He would offer alternative perspectives on the gang situation, remind Dutch of their shared history and values, and provide the kind of wise counsel that had guided the gang through previous crises. The psychological battle between Hosea and Micah was largely invisible to the other gang members, but was nonetheless crucial to the group's ultimate fate. Hosea's presence served as a counterbalance to Micah's nihilistic influence, providing Dutch with alternative perspectives and moral guidance that might have prevented his complete corruption. Their conflict was a struggle for Dutch's soul, with Hosea representing the better angels of his nature, while Micah appealed to his darker impulses. Micah's strategy for undermining Hosea was subtle but persistent. He would suggest that the old man's ideas were outdated, that his age made him less capable of understanding modern realities, that his caution was actually cowardice disguised as wisdom. These attacks were carefully crafted to exploit societal prejudices about aging while positioning Micah as the voice of youth, vigour, and pragmatic realism. When Hosea died during the disastrous St. Denis bank robbery, Micah had lost his greatest opponent, but the gang lost its moral compass. The impact of Hosea's death on the gang's psychological dynamics cannot be overstated. His wisdom and moral authority had provided stability and guidance during times of crisis, and his genuine care for all the gang members had helped maintain the family-like bonds that held them together. Without his moderating influence, Dutch became increasingly susceptible to Micah's manipulation, and the gang's moral centre began to collapse. The women of the gang, Abigail Roberts, Sadie Adler and the others, faced Micah's misogynistic worldview with varying degrees of resistance. His treatment of women as objects to be controlled or dismissed reflected a deeply ingrained hatred that likely stemmed from his upbringing in a hyper-masculine environment where women were either absent or powerless. This misogyny was not simply a product of his era's social attitudes, but reflected deeper psychological issues related to power, control, and his fundamental inability to see others as fully human. Abigail Roberts, as John Marston's partner and Jack's mother, represented everything that Micah's worldview could not accommodate. A woman who had found love and purpose through family relationships, who had chosen to build rather than destroy, who had found strength through connection rather than isolation. His dismissive attitude toward her reflected his inability to understand or value the kind of emotional bonds that gave meaning to her life. Sadie Adler's transformation from grieving widow to capable gunfighter represented an even greater challenge to Micah's psychological framework. When Sadie first joined the gang, she was vulnerable and traumatized, potentially susceptible to manipulation by someone skilled in exploiting emotional wounds. But rather than allowing her trauma to make her dependent on others or to corrupt her moral compass, Sadie channeled her pain into strength and her grief into determination. Her evolution into a formidable gunfighter and her refusal to be victimized by anyone ever again represented everything that Micah's worldview could not accommodate. Her development of agency and power, her demonstration that strength and courage were not exclusively masculine traits, and her ability to overcome trauma through her own will and determination exposed the fundamental weakness beneath Micah's aggressive facade. Micah's harassment of Sadie revealed his deep psychological insecurity about strong women who could not be controlled or manipulated. His attempts to intimidate and belittle her were driven not by strategic considerations, but by his fundamental fear of anyone who challenged his assumptions about power, gender, and human nature. When she refused to be cowed by his threats, when she met his aggression with her own fierce determination, she exposed the frightened, inadequate man hiding behind his mask of cruelty. The psychological significance of Sadie's resistance to Micah's influence extended beyond her personal strength to provide an example for other gang members, particularly the women who were often targets of his misogynistic behaviour. Her refusal to be controlled or diminished showed that it was possible to resist even the most persistent psychological pressure, and her example may have helped others find the courage to maintain their own boundaries and self-respect. Even young Jack Marston was not safe from Micah's psychological toxicity. His apparent enjoyment in frightening and intimidating a child revealed a level of cruelty that extended beyond strategic manipulation into genuine sadism. Most adults, even those with significant psychological problems, retain some capacity for empathy toward children that serves as a natural brake on harmful behaviour. Micah's lack of this basic human response suggested a profound deficit in his emotional development. The psychological impact of Micah's presence on Jack was evident in the child's increasing fearfulness and withdrawal as time passed. Children are particularly vulnerable to psychological manipulation and intimidation because they lack the experience and emotional resources to understand and resist such tactics. Jack's exposure to Micah's threatening behaviour represented a form of psychological abuse that could have lasting effects on his development and future relationships. Micah's treatment of Jack also revealed his complete absence of the protective instincts that characterize healthy adult psychology. Where other gang members went out of their way to shield Jack from the harsh realities of their criminal lifestyle, Micah seemed to take pleasure in exposing the child to fear and uncertainty. This behaviour toward a vulnerable child provided perhaps the clearest window into the depths of his psychological pathology. As the gang situation became increasingly desperate following the failed bank robbery in St. Denis, Micah's true nature began to reveal itself more clearly. The psychological mask he had worn to gain acceptance within the group started to slip, revealing the calculating predator beneath. His criminal methodology was not impulsive or desperate. It was calculated, strategic, and designed to maximize both material gain and psychological satisfaction. The gang's flight from St. Denis to the mountains marked a turning point in their collective psychology. The loss of Hosea, combined with the increasing pressure from law enforcement and the harsh conditions of their exile, created an environment where Micah's nihilistic philosophy seemed increasingly realistic. When people are desperate and afraid, they become more susceptible to manipulation by those who claim to offer pragmatic solutions to their problems. Micah exploited this vulnerability masterfully. He positioned himself as the voice of harsh realism, arguing that the gang needed to abandon their outdated ideals of honour and loyalty in favour of pure survival. He suggested that Dutch's old friends were holding him back, that their moral concerns were luxuries the gang could no longer afford, that only by embracing a more ruthless approach could they hope to survive. His approach to violence during this period went beyond mere functionality to include unnecessary cruelty, prolonged suffering, and apparent enjoyment of his victims' fear and pain. This sadistic component elevated his violence beyond simple criminality into the realm of psychological torture. His killings often involved excessive force beyond what was necessary to achieve his objectives, indicating strong emotional involvement and psychological gratification derived from the act of violence itself. The psychological principle of decompensation was clearly at work in Micah's behaviour during this period. As the pressure on the gang increased, his ability to maintain his facade of loyalty and camaraderie began to break down, revealing the nihilistic core of his personality. The chronic stress and hypervigilance required to maintain his deceptions, combined with the growing suspicion of other gang members, created mounting pressure that manifested in more desperate and violent actions. Dutch, isolated from his oldest advisors and increasingly paranoid about betrayal, found himself drawn deeper into Micah's sphere of influence. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. The idealistic outlaw leader who had once spoken eloquently about freedom and dignity was becoming a paranoid tyrant willing to abandon his principles and his friends in pursuit of one more score, one more escape, one more chance to prove his genius. The psychological techniques Micah employed in corrupting Dutch were sophisticated and multifaceted. He used flattery to feed Dutch's ego and grandiosity, making him feel special and superior to others. He employed isolation tactics to separate Dutch from sources of honest feedback and moral guidance, particularly from Arthur and the memory of Hosea. He utilised fear and paranoia to make Dutch suspicious of his oldest allies and dependent on Micah's support and validation. Perhaps most insidiously, Micah gradually redefined the gang's values and mission in ways that served his own interests while appearing to serve Dutch's vision. He reframed their criminal activities as necessary adaptations to changing circumstances, their abandonment of moral principles as realistic acceptance of harsh truths, and their betrayal of former allies as pragmatic decisions required for survival. This process of moral redefinition was particularly effective because it allowed Dutch to maintain his self-image as a visionary leader, even as his behaviour became increasingly harmful and destructive. By gradually shifting the framework through which actions were evaluated, Micah made previously unthinkable behaviours seem reasonable or even necessary. Dutch found himself engaging in actions that violated his deepest values, while believing he was being practical and realistic. The psychological impact of witnessing this transformation in Dutch was particularly devastating for Arthur Morgan, who'd looked up to the gang leader as a father figure and moral guide. Watching someone he loved and respected gradually become corrupted and cruel created a form of psychological trauma that went beyond simple disappointment or betrayal. It challenged Arthur's fundamental beliefs about human nature, moral development, and the possibility of maintaining one's principles in a harsh and unforgiving world. But Micah's most devastating betrayal was still to come. Faced with the choice between loyalty to his companions and personal survival, he had made a decision that would define his legacy forever. He had become an informant for the Pinkertons, the very law enforcement agents the gang had been fighting against. This ultimate act of treachery revealed that his apparent loyalty to the gang had always been conditional and strategic rather than genuine. The decision to betray the gang was not made in a moment of panic or desperation, but was the logical conclusion of Micah's psychological development and worldview. From his perspective, loyalty and friendship were simply commodities to be sold to the highest bidder, with no intrinsic value beyond their market price. He fed information to Agent Milton and the Pinkertons, ensuring that the gang's every move was anticipated and countered by their pursuers. The psychological sophistication of Micah's betrayal was evident in how he managed to maintain his cover while providing information to the authorities. He gave the Pinkertons just enough intelligence to maintain their interest and protection, while withholding crucial details that might compromise his own position. This delicate balancing act required significant psychological skill and demonstrated his ability to maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously. The impact of this betrayal extended far beyond the immediate practical consequences for the gang. It represented a violation of the fundamental social contracts that make human cooperation and community possible. By demonstrating that loyalty, trust, and mutual support were meaningless in the face of personal advantage, Micah undermined the very foundations of social cohesion that had held the gang together. The psychological trauma inflicted by this betrayal was particularly severe, because it came from someone who'd been trusted and considered family. This kind of betrayal creates wounds that can affect victims' ability to trust others and maintain healthy relationships for years or even decades after the initial betrayal. The gang members who discovered Micah's treachery had to grapple not only with the practical consequences of his actions, but also with the psychological damage caused by having their trust and faith in human goodness so thoroughly violated. Arthur Morgan, dying from tuberculosis, and finally seeing Micah's true nature clearly, confronted both Dutch and Micah at Beaver Hollow. The scene that unfolded was the culmination of months of psychological manipulation and corruption. Former friends and family members pointing guns at each other while Micah watched with satisfaction. The gang that had once been united by bonds of loyalty and affection was now shattered beyond repair, torn apart by the psychological poison that Micah had introduced into their midst. Arthur's response to discovering Micah's treachery revealed the depth of his character development and moral growth. Rather than being consumed by hatred or desire for revenge, Arthur channeled his anger into determination to protect the people he cared about, and to ensure that Micah's betrayal would not destroy everything the gang had built together. His focus shifted from personal vengeance to salvaging what could be saved from the wreckage of their former family. The confrontation at Beaver Hollow represented more than just a physical fight. It was the culmination of the philosophical struggle between Arthur and Micah over the nature of human goodness and the possibility of redemption. Arthur's choice to help John Marston escape rather than pursue the gang's money demonstrated that his moral transformation was complete and genuine, while Micah's focus on the treasure revealed that his priorities had never changed. Arthur's final act of defiance, choosing to help John Marston escape rather than pursue the gang's money, represented everything Micah could never understand or accept. Even facing death from tuberculosis, Arthur chose loyalty and sacrifice over self-preservation. His redemption was complete, but it came at the cost of his life. Whether Arthur died on the mountain from his illness or at Micah's hands depended on the choices made in those final moments. But either way, Micah had succeeded in destroying the man who represented everything he despised. The psychological significance of Arthur's death extended far beyond the immediate loss of a beloved character. His passing represented the death of the gang's moral center, the silencing of the voice that had reminded them of their better nature, the extinguishing of the light that had guided them through their darkest moments. With Arthur gone, the psychological virus that Micah had introduced into the gang could spread unchecked, completing the destruction of everything they had once held dear. The gang that had once been a family was now shattered beyond repair. Dutch, his mind poisoned by Micah's manipulation and his own paranoia, walked away from the carnage with Micah at his side. Bill and Javier, corrupted by Micah's influence and their own weaknesses, followed Dutch into an uncertain future. John Marston escaped with his life, but lost his brother and his family in one terrible night. The psychological aftermath of this destruction would continue to affect the survivors for years to come. The bonds that had provided meaning, purpose, and identity for all the gang members were severed in a matter of minutes, leaving each individual isolated and vulnerable in ways they had never experienced before. The gang had been more than just a criminal organization. It had been a source of identity, belonging, and meaning that could not easily be replaced. John Marston's struggle to build a new life after the gang's dissolution illustrates the challenges faced by individuals who must reconstruct their identity and relationships after experiencing such profound loss and betrayal. The process of healing from this kind of trauma requires not just time, but also the development of new sources of meaning and connection that can gradually replace what was lost. The years that followed saw Micah attempting to build his own gang in the mountains, but without the psychological manipulation skills being focused on a cohesive group with existing bonds of loyalty and affection, his efforts were largely unsuccessful. The men who followed him were drawn by fear and greed rather than the complex emotional connections that had made the Van der Linde gang so effective and enduring. Micah's inability to create genuine loyalty or inspire authentic devotion in his followers revealed the limitations of his psychological manipulation skills. While he was masterful at exploiting existing relationships and corrupting established bonds, he lacked the capacity to build something positive from nothing. His nihilistic worldview and complete absence of empathy made it impossible for him to understand or create the kind of meaningful connections that inspire true loyalty. The psychological isolation that Micah experienced during this period may have contributed to his increasing instability and desperation. Cut off from the gang that had provided him with purpose and targets for his manipulation, he found himself adrift in a world that was rapidly changing around him. The skills that had made him so effective at destroying the Van der Linde gang were less useful when it came to building and maintaining his own criminal organization. Dutch eventually recognized the monster he had allowed into his life, the psychological poison that had corrupted his judgment and destroyed everything he had built. The process of this recognition was gradual and painful, as Dutch slowly came to understand how thoroughly he had been manipulated, and how completely he had betrayed his own values and the people who had loved him most. The psychological journey that led Dutch to this moment of clarity was complex and tragic. Years of isolation from his former friends, combined with the growing realization that Micah's promises of wealth and power had been empty lies, gradually eroded the psychological defenses that had allowed him to justify his actions. The man who'd once been a charismatic leader and idealistic visionary was forced to confront the reality of what he had become under Micah's influence. When John Marston finally tracked Micah down to his camp on Mount Hagen in 1907, Dutch was already there, having come to his own reckoning with the man who had manipulated him so thoroughly. The confrontation on that frozen mountain represented more than just a settling of old scores. It was Dutch's attempt to reclaim some measure of his lost honour and to make amends for the terrible mistakes he had made under Micah's influence. The psychological significance of Dutch's presence at Mount Hagen cannot be overstated. His decision to confront Micah represented a moment of moral clarity that had been absent from his life for years. In choosing to stand against the man who had corrupted him, Dutch was attempting to reconnect with the better angels of his nature and to honour the memory of the friends he had betrayed. The confrontation on that frozen mountain was brief but decisive. Dutch, in a moment of clarity and perhaps redemption, shot Micah Bell and walked away without a word, leaving John to finish what Arthur had started. This action represented Dutch's final rejection of Micah's influence and his acknowledgement of the terrible damage that had been done to everyone he had once cared about. Micah's death at John's hands provided a form of closure, a final accounting for all the psychological wounds he'd inflicted, all the trust he had betrayed, all the love he had poisoned with his presence. But even in death, the impact of his psychological manipulation continued to reverberate through the lives of those who had survived his toxic influence. As Micah's body fell into the snow on that desolate mountain peak, the psychological virus he had spread through the Van der Linde gang finally died with him. But the scars he left behind would remain with the survivors for the rest of their lives. John would carry the trauma of betrayal and loss as he tried to build a new life with Abigail and Jack. The trust and innocence that Micah's actions had destroyed could never be fully restored. The psychological legacy of Micah's influence extended far beyond his immediate victims to affect future generations. Jack Marston, who had witnessed the destruction of his chosen family and the corruption of the men he had looked up to as father figures, would carry these traumatic experiences into his own adulthood. The psychological wounds inflicted during childhood often have lasting effects that can influence personality development, relationship patterns, and worldview throughout life. John struggled to protect his family from the consequences of his past, while dealing with his own psychological trauma illustrates the complex challenges faced by survivors of psychological manipulation and betrayal. The process of healing requires not just the passage of time, but also the development of new sources of meaning and connection that can gradually replace what was lost. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of Micah Bell's story is not the damage he inflicted on others, but the waste of his own potential. His intelligence, his psychological insight, and his strategic thinking could have been channeled toward constructive purposes. Instead, the poisoned legacy of his upbringing ensured that these gifts would be used only for destruction and manipulation. The psychological analysis of Micah's character reveals a complex interplay of environmental factors, developmental trauma, and individual choices that combine to create a profoundly destructive personality. His family history of violence and criminality, the absence of nurturing relationships in early childhood, the systematic conditioning toward nihilistic values, and the reinforcement of manipulative behaviors all contributed to his psychological development. But even in examining such a thoroughly corrupted individual, we must remember that the capacity for both great evil and great good exists within all human beings. The psychological mechanisms that Micah employed, manipulation, exploitation of vulnerabilities, the gradual erosion of moral boundaries, are not unique to him, but represent universal human capabilities that can be channeled toward either constructive or destructive ends. In the end, Micah Bell represents a cautionary tale about the power of psychological manipulation and the importance of recognizing toxic individuals before they can inflict their damage on communities and relationships. His story serves as a reminder that evil is not always obvious or dramatic. Sometimes it comes disguised as loyalty, wrapped in charm, and speaking words that people want to hear. The warning signs he displayed throughout his time with the gang, the manipulation tactics, the lack of genuine empathy, the willingness to betray trust for personal gain, the enjoyment of others' suffering, are patterns that can be observed in real-world toxic individuals. Understanding these patterns can help us recognize similar threats in our own lives and communities, protecting ourselves and others from psychological harm before it becomes irreparable. The psychological resilience demonstrated by characters like Arthur Morgan, Charles Smith, and Sadie Adler provides hope and practical guidance for dealing with toxic individuals in real life. Their examples show that it is possible to maintain one's moral center and emotional health even when exposed to persistent manipulation and psychological abuse. The strategies they employed, maintaining clear boundaries, staying true to their values, seeking support from trustworthy allies, and focusing on meaningful goals, can be applied in real-world situations involving toxic individuals. The gang members who resisted Micah's influence did so not because they were fundamentally different from those who succumbed, but because they maintained connections to sources of meaning and moral guidance that served as anchors against the psychological storms he created. Arthur's growing relationship with his journal and his reflections on morality, Charles's connection to his cultural values and sense of justice, Sadie's determination to honor her husband's memory through her own strength, All of these served as psychological resources that helped them resist corruption. The story of Micah Bell ultimately serves as a testament to the importance of community, moral education, and the cultivation of empathy in preventing the development of such destructive personalities. While we cannot always prevent individuals from choosing darkness, we can create environments and relationships that make such choices less likely, and that provide support for those who seek to choose differently. The psychological insights gained from analysing Micah's character can be applied to real-world situations involving toxic individuals, workplace bullies, manipulative family members, and other harmful personalities. Understanding the tactics such individuals employ and the psychological vulnerabilities they exploit can help people protect themselves and their communities from similar harm, while also providing guidance for supporting those who have been victimized by such individuals. The psychological journey through Micah Bell's twisted mind serves not to frighten us, but to arm us with the wisdom needed to recognize and resist similar threats. His story reminds us that while destructive personalities exist and can cause significant harm, they are not inevitable or insurmountable. Through awareness, education, and commitment to healthy relationships and communities, we can work to prevent the development of such toxic individuals while protecting ourselves and others from their harmful influence. The broader implications of Micah's story extend far beyond the fictional world of Red Dead Redemption 2 to provide insights into real-world patterns of psychological manipulation, abuse and recovery. His character serves as a case study in recognizing and understanding toxic personalities, while illustrating the devastating impact such individuals can have on communities and relationships. From an educational perspective, Micah's character demonstrates the importance of understanding personality disorders, recognizing manipulation tactics, and maintaining healthy boundaries in relationships. His behavior patterns provide clear examples of red flags that indicate someone may be psychologically dangerous to others. The gradual nature of his corruption of the gang serves as a warning about how toxic influences can spread through communities when left unchecked. The psychological mechanisms that Micah employed, isolation tactics, emotional manipulation, gradual moral corruption, exploitation of vulnerabilities, and the systematic erosion of trust, are techniques that can be observed in various forms of abuse and manipulation in real-world contexts. Understanding these patterns can help individuals and communities develop resistance to such influences and create support systems for those who've been victimized. The importance of early intervention becomes clear when examining Micah's psychological development. While his adult behavior was clearly destructive and harmful, understanding the childhood experiences that shaped his development can inform efforts to prevent similar outcomes in other at-risk individuals. The absence of nurturing relationships, the exposure to violence and criminality, and the systematic conditioning toward nihilistic values all contributed to his psychological pathology. Research in developmental psychology suggests that even individuals who experience severe childhood trauma can develop into healthy, empathetic adults if they receive appropriate support and intervention. This understanding provides hope for breaking cycles of abuse and violence, while also highlighting the importance of early identification and treatment of at-risk children. The psychological concept of resilience becomes crucial when considering how some individuals, like Arthur Morgan and Charles Smith, manage to maintain their moral center despite exposure to Micah's toxic influence. Resilience factors include the presence of supportive relationships, opportunities for positive experiences, strong personal values, and the development of healthy coping mechanisms. Arthur's journey toward redemption, despite his exposure to Micah's corruption and his own terminal illness, demonstrates the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to grow and change even in the most challenging circumstances. His ability to find meaning and purpose in his final months, to choose love over hate and sacrifice over self-interest, serves as an inspiring example of the possibility of moral transformation. Charles Smith's quiet strength and unwavering principles provide another model for resistance to toxic influences. His approach was characterized not by dramatic confrontation, but by steady adherence to his own values and principles, regardless of the social pressure or psychological manipulation he faced. This kind of moral consistency requires tremendous inner strength and self-awareness, but it can serve as an anchor of stability in environments where others are being swept away by manipulation and corruption. Sadie Adler's transformation from victim to survivor to protector illustrates another path of resistance and recovery. Her ability to channel her trauma into strength, her refusal to be defined by her losses, and her determination to protect others from similar harm demonstrate the possibility of post-traumatic growth and the development of resilience through adversity. The psychological aftermath of Micah's influence on the gang provides insights into the long-term effects of exposure to toxic individuals and the process of recovery from psychological manipulation and betrayal. The survivors of his corruption face the challenge of rebuilding their lives and relationships while dealing with the trauma of having their trust and faith in human goodness so thoroughly violated. John Marston's struggle to build a new life with Abigail and Jack illustrates the complex process of healing from betrayal trauma. His journey required not just practical considerations like establishing a new identity and finding legitimate work, but also the psychological challenge of learning to trust again and to believe in the possibility of genuine human connection after experiencing such devastating betrayal. The role of family relationships in John's recovery process cannot be overstated. Abigail's love and Jack's need for a father provided motivation to overcome his trauma and cynicism, to believe once again in the possibility of genuine human connection and family bonds. The psychological healing that occurs within healthy relationships demonstrates the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to overcome even the most severe psychological wounds. The psychological legacy of Micah Bell's character extends beyond entertainment to provide real-world lessons about recognizing and responding to toxic individuals, supporting those who've been victimized by psychological manipulation, and creating communities that foster healthy development and genuine human connection. His story serves as both a warning about the dangers of unchecked psychological manipulation and an inspiration to choose love, loyalty, and moral courage in the face of such threats. As the mountain winds blow through the peaks where Micah met his end, carrying away the last echoes of his poisonous influence, we are reminded that even the most toxic individuals cannot ultimately destroy the human capacity for growth, healing, and genuine connection. Arthur Morgan's redemption, Charles Smith's quiet strength, Sadie Adler's resilience, and John Marston's determination to build a better life all stand as testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest influences. The enduring fascination with Micah Bell's character speaks to something deeper in the human psyche, our need to understand the darkness that exists within our own species, To comprehend how individuals can become so thoroughly corrupted that they lose all capacity for empathy and genuine connection. His psychological profile serves as a mirror that reflects not only the worst possibilities of human nature, but also, by contrast, the precious value of the qualities he lacked. In the realm of psychological analysis, Micah represents what researchers might call a perfect storm of environmental and developmental factors that can create individuals with severe antisocial traits. His family history of violence and criminality, the absence of nurturing relationships in early childhood, the systematic conditioning toward nihilistic values, and the reinforcement of manipulative behaviors all combined to create a personality structure that was fundamentally oriented toward exploitation and destruction, rather than cooperation and creation. Yet even in examining such a thoroughly corrupted individual, we must remember that the capacity for such darkness exists, in potential, within all human beings. This recognition should inspire not fear, but vigilance and commitment to the values and relationships that protect us from such corruption. The gang members who resisted Micah's influence did so, not because they were fundamentally different from those who succumbed, but because they maintained connections to sources of meaning and moral guidance that served as anchors against the psychological storms he created. The story of Micah Bell ultimately serves as a testament to the importance of community, moral education, and the cultivation of empathy in preventing the development of such destructive personalities. While we cannot always prevent individuals from choosing darkness, we can create environments and relationships that make such choices less likely, and that provide support for those who seek to choose differently. The psychological insights gained from this exploration of Micah's character can serve as tools for building stronger, more compassionate communities and relationships in our own lives. Understanding the warning signs of toxic behavior, recognizing the tactics used by manipulative individuals, and developing the emotional intelligence needed to maintain healthy boundaries can help protect us and others from psychological harm. The importance of early intervention and support systems becomes clear when examining the factors that contributed to Micah's psychological development. While his adult behavior was clearly destructive and harmful, understanding the childhood experiences that shaped his development can inform efforts to prevent similar outcomes in other at-risk individuals. The absence of nurturing relationships, the exposure to violence and criminality, and the systematic conditioning toward nihilistic values all contributed to his psychological pathology. Community support systems, educational programs that teach empathy and emotional intelligence, and early intervention services for at-risk children can all play crucial roles in preventing the development of individuals like Micah Bell. By creating environments that foster healthy emotional development and provide support for those who have experienced trauma, we can work to break cycles of abuse and violence before they create new generations of victims and perpetrators. The psychological resilience demonstrated by characters like Arthur Morgan, Charles Smith, and Sadie Adler provides practical models for maintaining mental health and moral integrity in the face of toxic influences. Their strategies, maintaining clear personal values, seeking support from trustworthy allies, focusing on meaningful goals, and refusing to compromise their principles for social acceptance, can be applied in real-world situations involving manipulative individuals. The role of authentic relationships in providing protection against psychological manipulation cannot be overstated. The gang members who were most resistant to Micah's influence were those who maintained strong connections to sources of meaning and moral guidance outside of his sphere of control. Arthur's relationship with his journal and his growing moral awareness, Charles's connection to his cultural values, Sadie's determination to honour her husband's memory, all of these served as psychological anchors that helped them resist corruption. This understanding highlights the importance of cultivating diverse sources of meaning and support in our own lives. Individuals who depend too heavily on a single relationship or community for their sense of identity and worth may be more vulnerable to manipulation if that relationship becomes compromised. By maintaining connections to multiple sources of meaning, family, friends, spiritual communities, professional relationships, creative pursuits, and personal values, we can create a more resilient psychological foundation that is less susceptible to manipulation by toxic individuals. The story of Micah Bell also illustrates the importance of recognizing and addressing our own psychological vulnerabilities. Each of the gang members who fell under his influence had specific insecurities or needs that he was able to exploit. Bill's concerns about his intelligence, Javier's fear of abandonment, Dutch's need for validation, these were normal human vulnerabilities that became weapons in Micah's hands. By developing greater self-awareness about our own psychological needs and vulnerabilities, we can become less susceptible to manipulation, while also being more compassionate toward others who may be struggling with similar issues. This self-knowledge can help us recognize when someone is attempting to exploit our weaknesses and give us the tools to respond appropriately. Perhaps most importantly, Micah's story reminds us of the profound responsibility we all bear in choosing which aspects of our nature we will cultivate and express. The human capacity for both great evil and great good means that each of us faces daily choices about whether we will be sources of healing or harm in the lives of others. The psychological journey through Micah Bell's character serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of choosing wisely. In these quiet moments before sleep, as the shadows lengthen and the day's concerns fade away, we can find comfort in knowing that understanding such darkness helps us better appreciate and protect the light. The lessons learned from this exploration about manipulation, resilience, and the importance of genuine human connection can serve as tools for building stronger, healthier relationships in our own lives. The psychological complexity of Micah Bell's character serves as a reminder that evil is rarely simple or one-dimensional. Understanding the factors that contribute to the development of toxic personalities can help us respond more effectively to such individuals, while also working to prevent similar outcomes in future generations. This knowledge empowers us to create healthier communities, support those who have been victimized by psychological manipulation, and build relationships based on genuine care and mutual respect. The enduring power of this character study lies not in its darkness, but in the light it helps us recognize and protect. By understanding the psychological mechanisms that create individuals like Micah Bell, we become better equipped to choose differently, to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. The mountain peaks where Micah's story ended stand as silent witnesses to both the destructive power of psychological manipulation and the enduring strength of the human spirit. In the wind that whispers through those heights, we can hear echoes of both warning and hope. Warning about the dangers of unchecked toxicity, and hope in the knowledge that love, loyalty, and moral courage can ultimately triumph over even the darkest influences. The psychological journey through this complex character serves as both education and inspiration, reminding us of our capacity for both great harm and great good, and challenging us to choose wisely in our own lives and relationships. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that awareness and understanding are powerful tools for protecting what we value most. Even in the face of psychological darkness like that embodied by Micah Bell, the human capacity for growth, healing, and genuine connection remains our greatest source of hope and resilience. May your dreams be filled with the warmth of authentic relationships and the strength that comes from understanding both the shadows and the light within the human experience.